Hi Adam, hope you're well and thank you for your video update. So quite a lot to go over this week, so let's dive into it. So with your nutrition, and as you emailed across, you said kind of the thing for you this week has just been a bit of poor digestion. So what I would say is, obviously this isn't a huge amount of calories to be consuming right now. I think a lot of us, and I'm not saying you do this, but there was only two things that made me think about this. Was we follow some like quite big bodybuilders, or maybe some coaches who coach big unnatural bodybuilders, who consume thousands upon thousands upon thousands of calories during their off season. And so things like gut health, which is kind of a bit of a fun topic at the moment, I guess, or like ability to digest food, like you talked about gut, holding in the waistline and stuff, that becomes a much bigger concern for those guys because they have much more to control. They're eating way more food than you. They're much than us. They're much larger than us, and they've got issues with various things that are growing that are not meant to be necessarily growing because of the things they're taking. So they have to be very careful about their waistline and controlling that. And that is part of why, obviously, Phil Heath didn't do as well as he should have on stage, is because he couldn't control his gut as well. It was distended. And part of that is just down to the fact of what he's taking. Part of it is potentially laziness. Part of it is a lack of control. But for natural bodybuilders, we don't have things that are growing there. We should just be able to have general control of that area. And it's just some mindfulness. And I don't think, and I've kind of skipped nutrition a little bit and gone on to your question on the stomach vacuum training. I don't think it's something you need to do. I think it's something you can practice, like just when you're standing, rather than standing with your poor, like just no core control, and you're just standing with your gut distended, just suck it in, just hold it, and just practice that, and it'll become habit, and you'll just do it all the time. It's something I do. Like, I don't stand with my gut. Like, you see the before and afters, you see people with just their gut completely hanging out. So no one actually, like, as soon as I do that, I feel like my lower back's like not in a bit of a compromised position. I don't feel good. I don't feel tight. Whereas if I just stand tall, I hold my stomach in a little bit. That's just my general posture. So I think that's all you need to do. And I think for photo shoots and things, you just have to be ultra aware of it. And I will say, for my photo shoot as well with Simon Howard, especially my first one, because I was a bit better practiced by my second one, he was very on me to contract my abs. It's an unnatural thing, a photo shoot. He was like, I was just like doing like a bicep curl, and he was like, you have to contract your abs. And I was like, yeah, but this is just really strange. I would never contract my abs hard while doing a bicep curl. But he was like, this is for the photo. So I would take that with a pinch of salt a little bit. Hopefully that makes sense. Just because I listened to someone like Scott Stevenson. I think he's incredibly bright, talks a lot of good stuff, but a lot of his information is drawn upon his own experiences and working with advanced and enhanced athletes. Can't fucking speak. And you might be like, Steve, but you obviously, Mike Israetel's enhanced, but Mike Israetel's recommendations are very much based around his work with natural competitors, not enhanced, because he was obviously, he works for Renaissance Periodization, who are working with mostly natural athletes. And so all of his information coming out is very foundational, principle based around just humans, not enhanced. He does extra work outside of that, whereas I think Scott is more so talking to his large chunk of his audience is enhanced, which makes sense because that is where he's based around. Just thought I'd say that. I'm not saying you follow Scott necessarily. I'm just bringing up him because he's someone I follow who does talk about these things, but they are less applicable to, and here talk about like peak week, and here talk about diuretics and things, and these are things generally natural athletes want to, for the most part, avoid and not mess around with, because we don't have so many things to control. We're much simpler in many ways, but we have less power in many ways. Anyway, so with your nutrition, I don't think there's a lot of calories, and your digestion, obviously it's becoming a bit of a big topic now, and I think sometimes because so many people are talking about it, you almost think, oh, I'm massing now, I'm eating more food. People talk about it being harder to digest this much food, and maybe I have issues. And I think in some ways it's cool. It's making people aware. It's making people think about how food is sitting with them. But in some cases, it's sending people into thinking, oh, that's going to impact my gut. That's going to make me feel bad. My digestion whilst I'm bulking is going to be poor. So it's just like, is it a nocebo almost? Is it something that you've kind of, some people are hearing and we expect it to be bad? Because I think sometimes that happens and it's really sad. It's almost like you buy a brand and you hear good things about that brand, so you automatically assume everything with that brand is bang on and it's the best. Whereas it's not always the case. Sometimes it's a poor quality product. And likewise, there might be a brand that you've heard poor things about, you try it, and you've already got pre-assumptions about it. So it's just being aware of that. I think it's just important, because I know I do it myself. So in terms of looking over your diet and issues or anything there, the thing I actually picked out more than anything was the fact you're having meals that don't contain protein from the looks of things. And it looks like you're not getting that many protein feedings through the day. That's why I wanted to actually highlight. To maximize muscle protein synthesis through the day, you want to be having like 3 to 5 servings of high quality protein containing at least 20 grams minimum, but more so like 30 grams plus would be a really good safe barrier. And consuming that on quite regular intervals through the day, like every 3 to 5 hours, for example. And it looks like you're like on one of your days, I'm pretty sure your first 2 meals contain no protein, and it was just like cereal carbohydrates. So I think balancing your protein intake through the day is going to help somewhat, just from a maximal muscle perspective, maximizing muscle protein synthesis. But in terms of what looks like it could have been in your diet, I'd say if you look at your fiber intake across the week, it's a bit up and down, which sometimes can cause some issues. And last week, the week before the one just gone, your fiber intake was quite low. Obviously, fiber is just a foundational thing you can get sorted to improve your digestion. Too much is too much, too little is too little. You want around, for yourself, around 25 grams up to, as your carbohydrate intake is up to 50, I would say 500, sorry, almost. I would say 50 grams, 25 to 50 grams in that range, I think would be really good for you. Obviously, you're in that range this week, but there were some days where you were lower, and there's some days where you were higher than that. The thing that I wonder if it did impact your digestion was the tub of Halo Top. I have found when I'm massing in particular, my digestion when I'm massing as well is more like, I'm more regular going to the toilet. It's not as consistent, if that makes sense. My digestion seems to be better when I'm dieting, but it is a case of just pure quantity, just going through you. It's always going to be a bit less great when you're massing, especially like you're in a surplus, the body's trying to get rid of it. So that's to be expected. But I'd say a tub of Halo Top, because of the fact it has lots of sugar alcohols in there, and having a high dose of sugar alcohol sometimes can cause the stomach to be upset. I think that could have been what it was. I am fine with half a tub of Halo Top, but if I have a whole tub, quite often I feel a bit funny the next day and things aren't as good as they should be. So I wonder if it was that. But yeah, those were my main pickups of looking over your diet. Just general perception of kind of the stomach, control of the vacuum and things like that. So hopefully that answered that question and has gone over your nutrition. And in terms of, your kind of nutrition, supplements are the last thing you go to. I'd listen to the podcast and I generally just keep an eye on Dr. Fundero, Gabrielle Fundero. She is very evidence-based. She is not full of shit, quite literally. She is on the money with diet, with gut health and things of that nature, and she will tell you how it is. And I would keep an eye on her and her podcast appearances, because there's a lot you can do before you go towards supplementation, and supplements often don't do what we want them to. So I would, get that fiber outlined. I would, and if you're having a problem with milk, there may be a potential problem you have with dairy in general. I notice you have a fair amount of dairy just in your diet, which I think is actually a good thing, but that could be causing you an issue. That's something that's just an issue, something that can quite often cause an issue. But I think it might have been the Halo Top. So see if you kind of notice anything when you don't have Halo Top, and if it was just that, and maybe you can reduce the quantity of that you're consuming. So training wise, obviously caught up on one session, cool, no issues with the lower back, which is sounding brilliant. Obviously you said you had one low energy session and you're not sure why. These things happen. What I would say is just look at what happened that day, the day before, the night before. How was your nutrition? Was there anything outlier? Was there anything different? If there wasn't, then we all have these days where we just don't feel 100%. They happen and you do your job. You go into the gym, you deposit pennies, you do your job. That's what you did. So I'm happy with that. But if you can learn from it, then it's always good. So you talked about back muscles being tight, helping your mind-muscle connection, good or bad. Having a good mind-muscle connection is brilliant. Tight muscles, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by that. So it's hard for me to really say anything apart from good mind-muscle connection sounds good. That's great. I'm not really sure what tight muscles means. It's quite a, to me, quite obscure description of, I'm not exactly sure what that means. I don't know if that means you just get like a good pump quite quickly with your back work. That's cool, and that's good to know. And it might mean that you need less volume. And if you have a good mind-muscle connection, probably you will need less volume, which is great. So you talked about kind of getting bored into the 5th set of squats, and you didn't really say anything more apart from you got bored. It's understandable. I wouldn't describe it as bored when I'm doing squats, in particular squats. I could call lateral raises potentially getting a little bit boring, but squats I would call challenging, hard, almost to a point of not enjoyable when I'm doing that much volume, but not boring. So it's interesting to hear you said that. Just I didn't have anything more to say on it because obviously you're kind of understanding the idea there. And you said you will do it, you're getting great pumps, and your idea of biceps is correct. Like I talked about that before. Stress response adaptation curves, biceps are a small muscle, they can do with high frequency training. So that's why they are like that. Is it necessary? No, but is it more beneficial? Likely. There's good rationale behind it. So something I did want to explain, because I've seen in a lot of your training at the moment, you're repeating performance across sets. So for squats, for example, you got 6, 6, 6, 6, 6. So there's not necessarily an inherent problem with that. But what I would expect to see is more like 8, 8, 7, 6, or something like that. It doesn't necessarily have to be that. Or it might be 6, 6, 5, 4, or something like that. Because as we're doing sets, I'm imagining your fatigue is building. And therefore, every single set you're doing, if you're taking it to the reps in reserve, you'd be getting less reps. So for example, some muscle groups are great at repeating performance, and some exercises, it just is easy to. So for like a dumbbell lateral raise or cable lateral raise, like that's a small muscle group. It's not a big compound lift. You cannot quite often repeat performance on that. But for me, for like bench, for squats, if I get 10 and I have 2 reps in reserve, it's unlikely my next set I'm going to get 10 again with 2 reps in reserve. It's probably going to be a 9 or an 8. And then a set after that, again, it might be a 9 and an 8, or it might be a 7. I see reps drop off as fatigue builds within the sets. So what you don't want to happen is you do that first set, you hit 6 reps, and then the next, and that maybe that was 5 reps in reserve. Then maybe the next set you do 6 reps. Maybe that's 4 reps in reserve. Then maybe you do another 6. Maybe that was 3, and then you do another set, and that was 2 reps in reserve. So in fact, you've actually underdosed your intensity and your volume because you're landing at 5 reps in reserve at the first set. Whereas actually you might have got an 8 at 3 reps in reserve, say, and then a 7 at 3 reps in reserve, and then a 6 at 3 reps in reserve, because you're losing a rep as fatigue's building. So it's just to make sure that when you're working with a load and a reps in reserve, that you are hitting that reps in reserve. And it might just be that your first sets aren't intense enough, and you're actually only hitting that reps in reserve by your last set, which means actually you've done a fair amount of kind of less productive volume, and that can be tricky. So that's what I'd like to see. And then in terms of kind of, you talked about if I was to stay at those reps in reserve, I'd lose the rep range. I'd move out of the lower end of it. There's 2 things you can do in that situation. So we know for hypertrophy, the most important thing is volume after intensity is met. So long as you've got sufficient intensity, it's as much volume as you can do and recover from. That sounds very simple. It's a very complex statement. So when we're talking about doing sets, I want you to stay in the reps in reserve. That's the most important thing, because if you go too close to failure on those, then you're going to fatigue acutely and you're going to get less volume within that session, and you're going to see chronic fatigue building very fast. It's going to be very difficult to progress in future weeks if you're already leaving 1 rep in reserve from your first or second week? Where do you go from there? It's very difficult to progress. So sufficient intensity is relative. So that's 3-4 reps in reserve is if you don't go as hard as that, you're probably leaving quite a lot on the table. And then it seems to be 60% of your 1 rep max. But if you've got that relative intensity, the repetition range or the load on the bar doesn't matter as much. We're seeing you can grow muscle with really high repetitions. So when you're coming to a point where, okay, if I do this next set, I'm either going to land below the rep range to keep to the reps in reserve, or I'm going to have to lower the weight to allow me to land within the rep range. If you're seeing that you're going to land just below the rep range, say it's like 6 to 8 and you're going to hit like a 5 or a 4 and it's your last set, I think that's fine. It's cool. It's good data to have because it might mean that we don't need to progress your volume anymore because we're seeing quite a drop off in performance. And that means you're probably doing and creating a lot of fatigue, and that's good. And that's all we need. Whereas if you're looking like, okay, if I do another set, I'm going to hit like 3 reps, I would reduce the load. And you don't reduce the load so much that you're coming out when you're making it super light. You just reduce it like 10% maybe at most. And then you're still getting good volume in, which is the most important thing, given you've got enough intensity. Hopefully that makes sense, Adam. I just want to make sure you're working hard enough. So for this next week, I am not increasing set numbers. I'm going to make sure you're hitting those intensity levels, that relative intensity on every single set, because that's important. You have to earn the right to do higher volumes. People often will go to really high volumes because they think volume is king, but in reality, intensity has to be met, and that's relative intensity before you add volume. So you earn that through working hard enough. And I'm not saying you're not necessarily working hard enough, but maybe some of the things has kind of perked up a few light bulbs to allow you to work harder and get more from less, which is great. So front delt volume, it made me laugh when you said there's not much front delt volume. So only because the front delts are one of the most abused muscle groups. Any overhead pressing, they get demolished. We're not doing overhead pressing. Any flat pressing, any incline pressing, the front delts are worked basically as much as the pecs, especially incline pressing. They're getting tons of work. You don't need extra. It's very similar to, and like I've never seen one person ever lack front delt. They might lack upper chest. They might lack a bit of chest. I've never seen anyone lack the front delt. It's just involved in all pressing. So that's why we have no direct overhead pressing, because I don't think you need it personally. And if you like doing it, then that's a different case, and we can make a case for that and we can include it in future. But I don't think it's something we need to do. And I think it's in a muscle group that gets a ton of work through other means. And unless it's a glaring weak point, you would never try and kind of purposely put in more volume for that, because I think you can get more benefits from putting volume in other places, because we only have so much volume and money to spend on that before our recovery goes to poo. So we might as well spend it on the best, most appropriate things. So is it an issue resting on Sunday and Monday? Really, I can throw that back to you. Do you feel like it's an issue resting Sunday and Monday? Do you feel like your performance declines because you're not having a rest day, especially between your pull and then your lower day? Because obviously you're doing barbell bent over rows. There's a fair amount of lower back involved with those. And then you're doing a lower body day with barbell RDLs, which again has quite a lot of lower back. So I just throw it back at you. Do you feel like your performance declines because you have 2 rest days in a row and you don't have a rest day like before that lower body day? If it's, no, actually, Steve, 2 rest days is fine. I'm not seeing any downsides to it. It's not a problem. That is as simple as that. It really is. So I've gone over the stomach vacuum, gone over protein spread, tub of Halo Top. Sweet. I think I've covered everything. So I think this is the longest video I've ever left anyone, but you had a lot of interesting questions, and I wanted to give you full comprehensive answers, and hopefully I have. Otherwise, that's everything I've got for you this week, Adam. Food's staying the same. Like I said, set numbers are staying the same in the gym, and we can push forward from here. So cheers, mate. Take care.